In this next part, I'm going to take a look at the date of the writing of the book of Revelation, and this is no light matter for the preterists. It would be no exaggeration to say that this is a critical part of the life support system that undergirds preterism, and if it is shown to be in error in any way, the whole system collapses. Since the 19th century, as to when the book of Revelation was written has become a key issue in the study of Revelation in particular and Bible eschatology in general, and no doubt this has been driven by the preterists whose everlasting all hangs on this matter. To the historicists and futurists, this issue makes no essential difference, although it is a point of interest. And this is not because historicism and futurism are similar in any way, but rather it's simply a fact that both believe that the correct date of the writing of Revelation is 95 to 96 AD. Now let's state the obvious up front. That is, that there is no date provided in the book of Revelation itself that tells us when it was written. No surprises here. But at the very commencement, this very basic thing presents a significant obstacle for the preterists. The book must be written prior to AD 70, otherwise they will be found naked and ashamed. Given that no internal date is provided, one has to appeal to extra biblical sources for support, and of course this can be problematic, especially, I'll say that again, most especially when your entire system of eschatology is dependent on a date, a narrow window of time, as just a few too many years one way or the other will sink the whole ship. For the preterists, the writing of the book of Revelation must always be a few years earlier than AD 70, somewhere in the mid-60s AD, and if not, their system of eschatology completely falls apart. So whatever evidence is put forward to show a post-AD 70 writing, and there is plenty of this, it has to be torn down and completely shredded by the preterists. Remember, their system is so date dependent that they cannot even allow the remotest possibility of a date too close to AD 70 and certainly nothing beyond it. Therefore, they must attack with the utmost zeal anything that is contrary to this position. Most scholars hold to one of two main dates for the composition of Revelation. Number 1, AD 65 to 66 during Nero's reign, or number 2, AD 95 to 96 in Domitian's reign. The Neronic date is strongly championed, and the other date most vehemently criticized by contemporary preterists who view Revelation primarily as a prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70 and a literal 42 months or 3.5 years of great tribulation leading up to that destruction. Therefore, if Revelation is indeed a prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem which occurred in August AD 70 and also the 3.5 years of great tribulation that preceded this, then it had to have been written no later than about March AD 67. The preterist interpretation therefore depends on a pre-March 67 date of composition, not just a pre-AD 70 date as is sometimes implied. But again, the bottom line in all of this is that there is no internal evidence of its dating, so one has to appeal to extra biblical sources which are of course uninspired, and additionally most of this extra biblical evidence points to an AD 95 to 96 dating. So surely if you're going to back a winner, you would start to question putting all of your money and your reputation on the line in this situation. Now, preterists often appeal to what is called internal evidence in the book of Revelation itself, which they believe shows that the book had to have been written prior to AD 70, like, for example, Revelation 11, which refers to the temple, which they say is the literal Jewish temple before it was destroyed. However, as we have previously seen, when you take a systematic approach to Revelation chapter 11 and start in Revelation 1, it becomes absolutely clear that Revelation 11 can refer to nothing other than the New Testament temple, the body of Christ, the church. So again, the preterists are in trouble having built their house on shifting sand. But whatever the case may be, the preterist claim for internal evidence is obviously based on an interpretive view and not on anything specifically stated concerning the date within the book of Revelation itself. Now, let's continue to look at this further. One of the popular preterists, Ken Gentry, writes this in his book, The Beast of Revelation. Basically, there are two possibilities regarding the date of Revelation's composition which are open to evangelical Christians. John may have written Revelation prior to the destruction of the temple, which occurred in AD 70, or possibly he composed it a generation later, around AD 95 to 96, in the last days of the reign of the Emperor Domitian. The second view is the majority opinion among contemporary commentators. The first view is the conviction of the present writer and a growing minority of biblical scholars. So here Ken Gentry sets out some of the things which we have just been looking at. Ken Gentry goes on and says, if the late date of around AD 95 to 96 is accepted, a wholly different situation would prevail. The events in the mid and late 60s of the first century would be absolutely excluded as possible fulfillments. The prophecies within Revelation would be open to an abundance of speculative scenarios which could be extrapolated into the indefinite future. Revelation might outline the course of church history according to any number of outlines or to certain general principles. So the writer here acknowledges the fact that if Revelation was written around 95 to 96, as most people believe it is, then the preterist interpretation of Revelation would be untenable. And then he says something shocking. He says that Revelation might outline the course of church history. Wow, wouldn't that be terrible, that the book of Revelation might be interpreted as historicists interpret it? That people might find that God has indeed provided a light to his people down through these last 2,000 years. Preterists, of course, cannot allow such a possibility. It is anathema to them. The preterist R.C. Sproul says in his book, The Last Days According to Jesus, this: if the book was written after AD 70, then its contents manifestly do not refer to events surrounding the fall of Jerusalem. And this is why they have to defend their mid-60s dating for the composition of the Revelation so vigorously and cannot give an inch. If they do, their entire system of eschatology falls apart. So these early date advocates have a burden of proof to discharge, since the AD 95 date is the accepted and traditional date among most Bible scholars, and acknowledging this, R.C. Sproul says, the burden for preterists then is to demonstrate that Revelation was written before AD 70, and I'll come back to this burden of proof again shortly. Steve Gregg writes in his book, Revelation 4 Views, this: the principal criticism of the preterist approach is its heavy dependence on the pre-AD 70 date of writing, which is defensible but not undisputed. Now, I do wish to add that anything that people defend may be regarded as defensible, as this is a subjective assessment. But whatever the case, the main issue is that the date of the writing of the book of Revelation is debatable, more so now than ever before because of the more recent rise of preterism. Steve Gregg goes on, another problem associated with the preterist approach is related to its alleged roots. Critics have traced the origins of preterism to the Jesuit Louis de Alcazar, 1544 to 1613, who formulated it to refute the Reformers' historicist view. Thus, preterism is said to share similar disreputable origins with futurism, with both of them being Roman Catholic responses to Protestantism, and I'm going to come back more to this point later. Steve Gregg goes on and says, however, elements of the preterist approach to both Revelation and the Olivet Discourse were held by some much earlier than Alcazar's time. In the early 4th century, the church historian Eusebius recognize in the Olivet Discourse and the Great Tribulation a description of Jerusalem's destruction by the Romans, though Eusebius did not extend the application to Revelation. I take it that this writer is stating this to be balanced in his analysis of preterism, but what he says here does not support preterism, but rather it supports historicism. Historicists believe that we find the destruction of Jerusalem and the tribulation in the Olivet Discourse, but that in no wise extends to the book of Revelation. So it sounds to me like Eusebius was on track to become an early historicist. Steve Gregg goes on and says, early in the 6th century, Andreas of Cappadocia wrote a commentary on Revelation that is still in existence. Though he did not take the preterist approach, he knew of some who did. Another commentary on Revelation, written probably in the 6th century by Arethes, on Revelation 7 verse 1, Arethes writes, here then were manifestly shown to the evangelists what things were to befall the Jews in their war against the Romans. Now there is nothing new with these kinds of statements. The futurists also point to evidence of futurism with some of the early writers. From an historicist's point of view, this is quite normal. In order to gain an appreciation of the proper historical application of prophecy, what has to happen? History has to happen, of course. History is prophecy fulfilled, so unless enough time is allowed to pass and the events are actually fulfilled, all a person can do prior to that is speculate on what the prophecy might relate to. Could it be referring to something that happened long ago, or perhaps something yet to occur? Now, getting back on track concerning the date of the writing of the book of Revelation, we read from Henry Grattan Guinness in his book Key to the Apocalypse, where he says, the testimony of Irenaeus, who was Polycarp's disciple, who was himself the disciple of the Apostle John, is of special importance on this point. Speaking of the number of the beast in the Apocalypse, he says, quote, for it, the Apocalypse, was seen no very long time ago, but almost in our age, towards the end of the reign of Domitian. End of quote. Grattan Guinness goes on, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus, and others of the early fathers confirm this testimony. Victorinus, who wrote a commentary on the Apocalypse toward the close of the 3rd century, says twice over that the visions of the Apocalypse were seen by the Apostle John in the Isle of Patmos when banished thither by the Roman Emperor Domitian. The commentary of Victorinus is the earliest on the Apocalypse extant. The external evidence as to the Domitian date of the Apocalypse is clear and certain, and then he provides a quote from Baird Lecture on the Revelation of St. John by Professor Milligan, which says this, quote, from the first witness who speaks upon the point in the latter half of the 2nd century down to the first half of the 5th, we have a succession of fathers bearing testimony with one accord and in language which admits of no misunderstanding to the fact that St. John was banished to Patmos under the reign of Domitian, and that there he beheld those visions of the Apocalypse which he afterwards committed to writing. These fathers too are men of ability, learning, and critical insight into the history of bygone times. They belong to the most different and widespread regions of the Church, to Gaul, Alexandria, the proconsular province of North Africa, Pannonia, Syria, and Rome. They are thus in a great degree independent of each other, and they convey to us the incontestable impression that, for at least the first 4 centuries of the Christian era, and over the whole extent of the Christian Church, it was firmly believed that St. John had beheld the visions of the Apocalypse in the days of Domitian and not of Nero. End quote. Remember the preterist R.C. Sproul said, if the book was written after AD 70, then its contents manifestly do not refer to events surrounding the fall of Jerusalem. And he also said, the burden for preterists then is to demonstrate that Revelation was written before AD 70. And it is agreed that the burden of proof rests with those who seek to prove the early date. And concerning the level of proof that is required, preterists must at least meet the minimum legal burden of proof by a preponderance of the evidence, and this they simply cannot do. Now here we have a quote from an eminent supporter of the early dating for the Book of Revelation. It's from Fenton John Anthony Hort, and he says this: "We begin with the evidence for Domitian's reign. This is virtually external only, but the testimony is undoubtedly weighty." Now, if you are aware of the origins of modern Bible translations, you will probably recognize the name Fenton Hort taken together with Brooke Westcott, as these two names are the men who were responsible for replacing the universal text of the authorized version of the Bible with the local text of Egypt and the Roman Catholic Church. Both Westcott and Hort were known to have resented the preeminence given to the authorized version, the King James Version, and its underlying Greek text, and instead they favored the Roman Catholic manuscripts called Vaticanus and Aleph. This is quite a lengthy matter to discuss. However, the point is that Hort is a friend of the Church of Rome. But even Hort, as much as he favored an early date for the revelation, which would help the case for preterism and would favor the Church of Rome, even he has to admit that there is a distinct weight in favor of a Domitian dating for the revelation. Methinks you are in trouble when some of your best advocates for preterism and the Church of Rome recognize that not only can the early date not be proved, but the weight of evidence is stacked against it. Hort says, if external evidence alone could decide, there would be a clear preponderance for Domitian. In response to this, it would be fair to ask, if the supposed AD 65 to 66 date for Revelation is in fact correct, this would mean that it had a 30-year head start on the later Domitian date. So, if this was the case, why was it not the overwhelming view of the early church? Why did it take some 400 years before it began to appear? The early date would have enjoyed every advantage to establish itself as the accepted date by the church fathers, yet the opposite is the case. The AD 95 date became the accepted dominant date. Why? Could it be that this is simply because it is the correct date? In B.W. Johnson's The People's New Testament, we read this: only two dates for the composition are named. Number one, that always assigned to it by the ancient church near the end of the reign of the Emperor Domitian, which extended from AD 81 to AD 96. And number two, that which has been urged upon by certain modern critics, the latter part of the reign of Nero, about AD 65 to 68. The first date is supported by the historical testimony. Mark L. Hitchcock writes in his paper called A Critique of the Preterist View of Soon and Near in Revelation this: actually, 4 dates for Revelation have been held throughout church history. Claudius, AD 41 to 54, Nero, 54 to 68, Domitian, 81 to 96, and Trajan, 98 to 117. A fifth view, held by several modern scholars, dates Revelation in the years immediately following Nero, about AD 69. Still, another view is held by David Orne, who says that the first edition of Revelation was composed during the reign of Nero, while the final edition was completed toward the end of the reign of Domitian, or more likely, he says, during the early part of the reign of Trajan. So it seems to be licorice all sorts for some people. However, this level of uncertainty, held by some at least, certainly does not help the preterists. In the book Commentary on Revelation Practical and Explanatory, the author Howard Winters says, under the subheading Time of Writing, the following: when the interpretation depends upon the date, the interpretation can never be more certain than the date itself. If the date is wrong, then, of necessity, the interpretation is wrong. The whole business of making the interpretation depend upon the date is therefore built upon a sandy foundation. Consider this fact. If the understanding of the book itself depends upon the date, then it depends upon something that is not in the book itself, something that is not revealed, and something that is now impossible to establish beyond a reasonable doubt. But besides this, the force of the evidence, whether internal or external, is against an early date. And then over the page he says, but if the late date is correct, the whole approach that assigns Revelation as a prophecy fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem is false and must be totally rejected. In Eliot's Horae Apocalypticae Volume 1, under the subheading The Date of the Apocalypse, we read this: For the testimony of Irenaeus, Polycarp's disciple, let it again be remembered, who was himself the disciple of the Apostle John, is as expressed to the point in question as it is unexceptional. And then he quotes Irenaeus, the same quote that we read from earlier when we looked at Grattan Guinness's work. Irenaeus said, for it, the apocalypse evidently, was seen no very long time ago, but almost in our age, toward the end of the reign of Domitian. Eliot goes on, it is as clear a testimony on the point it relates to as there can be found to any other fact in any other historian. Now, in relation to this very well-known quote from Irenaeus, I realise that the preterists vigorously attack this testimony. And as we have already stated, the preterists have to do this because their entire prophetic system falls to pieces if Irenaeus is found to be correct. The preterists attack Irenaeus' testimony concerning the Domitian dating of Revelation on three fronts. Firstly, they say that the Greek language used in Irenaeus' statement is ambiguous and that there is considerable doubt over what he actually said. To this I will add that it is only ambiguous if you want it to be. This issue of ambiguity has only come about because of preterism. No one ever questioned Irenaeus' statement for over 1600 years, and I'm going to talk more about this shortly. The second front that the preterists attack the testimony of Irenaeus is that they claim that he is an unreliable witness, and they base this on the fact that Irenaeus erred in his writing when he claimed that Jesus was 50 years of age when he died. And so they conclude if he's wrong here, well, he must be wrong everywhere else. Now, in response to this, one has to realize that while Irenaeus did indeed err, it was a clear error. He had misunderstood what was written in John chapter 8. But this does not mean that we throw everything else that he said out of the window. Who of us would be able to stand if this kind of standard was applied to each of us? The preterists would be the only ones to apply this kind of high standard to Irenaeus, and they do this simply because his testimony cuts across what they believe. The third front on which they attack Irenaeus is that they say that he simply parroted what others had told him. And so the attack just becomes plain silly, and in my opinion it's unworthy of fellow Christians. If this accusation was indeed true, why did those that follow Irenaeus perpetuate this error? Weren't they capable of thinking for themselves? Couldn't they or didn't they read all the other writings that were available to them? And what of the fact that Irenaeus was Polycarp's student, who himself was the disciple of John? The fact is that Irenaeus was so close to the action and the original players that we can be sure that his testimony on this fact is indeed reliable. E.B. Eliot goes into this matter in great detail in the Horae Apocalypticae Volume 1, 5th edition, starting on page 32, and you should check this out if you are in any doubt. In the next few slides, I will just take a few quotes from Eliot dealing with this entire matter. Concerning Irenaeus' testimony, Eliot goes on in the Horae Apocalypticae and says this: nor is it unsupported by other testimony. First, Tertullian seems in no dubious manner to indicate this view of the apocalyptic date. For in his Apology, after specifying Nero's as the first imperial persecution, he proceeds to notice Domitian's as the next persecution, and this as one in which Christians suffered by banishment, the well-known punishment inflicted on St. John. It is evident that Eusebius thus understands Tertullian. I mean as alluding to St. John's banishment as the act of Domitian. Eliot then cites the evidence of Clement of Alexandria, and you can read the details of that on pages 33 and 34 of his book. He cites Victorinus, Bishop of Pedor and martyr in Diocletian's persecution, who says twice over expressly and in a part that bears no mark of interpolation that the apocalypse was seen by the Apostle John in the Isle of Patmos when banished thither by the Roman Emperor Domitian. Coming to Eusebius, Eliot says, though doubting about the author of the apocalyptic book, yet on the date of St. John's banishment to Patmos, he distinctively intimates more than once his agreement with the tradition of the ancients that refer to Domitian's persecution, and indeed implies, as is perfectly evident, that he knew no other tradition whatsoever as to the time of St. John's banishment to Patmos. Eliot continues, the same is the recorded judgment of Jerome, the same of Augustine's friend Orosius, the same of Sulpicius Severus. Once more we find an unhesitating statement of similar support in Primasius, an eminent Augustinian commentator on the Apocalypse of the 6th century. Other ancient testimonies of less importance might yet be added, and in relation to this he includes a footnote 6 and mentions Jordandes, a historian of the 6th century, Isidore of Seville about 600 AD, Pseudo-Prochorus, and I'll leave it up to you to read Eliot's book to understand who Pseudo-Prochorus is, and then also he mentions Roman Martyrology published by order of Gregory XIII. Eliot then addresses the very sloppy claim made by the preterists that the early church fathers didn't do their homework and simply parroted what Irenaeus had said. So Eliot adds this, such is the later and subsidiary patristic testimony still extant to the fact of St. John having seen the apocalyptic visions in Patmos under the reign of Domitian. A chain of testimony not to be viewed as but the repetition of that of Irenaeus, whom indeed for the most part these writers do not even refer to, but as their own deliberate independent judgment, formed on all the evidence which then existed. As to any contrary early tradition respecting the date, if such there was, it can scarcely have been unknown to them, and their total silence respecting it is only explicable on one of two suppositions, viz., either that it did not exist, or that they deemed it undeserving of credit and not even worth the notice. Nor can this be wondered at, seeing as to the contrary statement on the point in question, there appears to have been none whatsoever until the time of Epiphanius, Bishop of Salamis, also pronounced Salamis. I suppose it depends on how hungry you are. Excuse my levity. Until the time of Epiphanius, Bishop of Salamis in Cyprus in the latter half of the 4th century. Thus, to conclude, the varied historical evidence which has been inquired into all concurs to confirm the date originally and expressly assigned by Irenaeus to the Apocalypse as seen and written at the close of the reign of Domitian, that is, near the end of the year 95 or beginning of 96. Accordingly, the great majority hitherto of the most approved ecclesiastical historians and biblical critics, alike Roman Catholic and Protestant, French, German and English, writers who have had no bias on the point in question one way or the other from any particular theory of interpretation, for example, Dupuis, Bosway, Tillemont, Leclerc, Turrentine, Spanheim, Basnage, Lomp, Mosheim, Mill, Whitby, Lardner, etc. have all alike adopted it, to whom I am happy to add the modern names of the German ecclesiastical historian Geisler, as well as our own church historians Buttron and Waddington, also the very learned classical chronologist Finnes Clinton. Or perhaps that should be Fines Clinton. And if you're currently laughing your head off at my attempted pronunciation of all of those names, then I forgive you, just as I've had to forgive my wife who did the same when she heard me record this. Eliot continues, we may, I am persuaded, depend on its correctness with as unhesitating and implicit confidence as on the truth of almost any of the lesser facts recorded in history. And as I wrap up this section, I have here one final quote from Eliot concerning Irenaeus' testimony and what Moses Stuart, the man who brought preterism to the United States, had to say about it. Under the subsection Professor Lux and Stuart's external or historical evidence, Eliot says this, and here, in his opening summary, Professor Stuart admits distinctly in the first instance the futility of the attempts that have been made to get rid of Irenaeus' famous testimony asserting the Domitianic date by supplying another nominative case. Then Eliot says that one is astonished at this time of day to find any respectable writer so bewildering himself as to attempt the revival of the absurdities that Professor Stuart thus rejects. Well, there it is. Even the big name in preterism in the United States, Moses Stuart, does not believe that there is any ambiguity in what Irenaeus had said. So we have seen that the weight of evidence is in favour of a later date for the composition of the Book of Revelation. But even if you are not in agreement with this entirely, the early date adherents cannot escape the fact that there is no way of proving their case beyond reasonable doubt. Preterism is built on a sandy foundation, and this is not what wise men do. Eliot said, "It seems to me to be most surprising that respectable and learned commentators should have spent their time and labour in building up apocalyptic expositions that rest wholly and only on the sandy foundation of an earlier Neronic date." And I will end this section with that.